Welcome to Void Histories, a space where the past is not rushed, but unfolded slowly, like the turning of worn pages beneath quiet hands. Here, history is more than dates or battles. It is memory, it is sorrow, it is the lingering echo of voices that still whisper through time. Tonight we enter the Cuban struggle, Empire's shadow, a story not only of wars and treaties, but of wounds carried across generations, of dreams deferred, and of a people who endured beneath the weight of empire. As you listen, let your breath slow. Let the story move gently, like waves brushing the shore at night. For history, when told softly, becomes less a lesson and more a companion in the dark. If you find comfort here, stay with us. There are many shadows to walk through, many forgotten echoes waiting to be heard, and together we will drift into them, slowly, quietly, until the silence tells its tale. The Cuban struggle, Empire's shadow. There are stories that are not told to rush the heart, but instead to slow it down. Stories that ask you to listen in the quiet spaces between words, like waves breaking softly upon the shore. This is one of those stories. It begins with an island, a place touched by the warm embrace of the Caribbean Sea, where time once moved at the pace of the rising sun and the rhythm of tides. This island was Cuba, before the heavy footsteps of empire ever fell upon its soil. Imagine it as it once was, an island breathing in its own music, villages alive with laughter, drums echoing in the distance, songs carried in the twilight air. The people lived close to the land, drawing sustenance from the fertile earth, planting with reverence, harvesting with gratitude. Tobacco leaves curled toward the sky, sugar cane swayed gently in the wind, and fishermen cast their nets into waters so clear that the sunlight danced like silver beneath the waves. In those early days, life was not free of hardship, but the spirit of the people carried something deeper, dignity. There was rhythm in their days, balance in their seasons, and a sense that life, though fragile, belonged to them. The elders told stories by firelight, children fell asleep to the lull of the sea, and the island's heart beat quietly, steady and unbroken. When we picture this Cuba, before the shadow of conquest, we see not just land, but soul, a soul rooted in community, in ritual, in joy that did not need permission. The island was not yet reduced to numbers or profit, not yet carved into pieces by hands that did not love it. It was whole. It was enough. And yet, across the ocean, in distant courts and palaces, Cuba's existence was already being rewritten in minds that would never walk its fields or hear its music. To them, the island was not a home, but a possession, not a people, but a resource. In their imagination, the island's soil was wealth waiting to be claimed, and its people were labor waiting to be bent. But here, in this beginning, let us rest for a moment in the image of Cuba before the ships arrived. The palm trees leaning gently toward the sea, the scent of roasted coffee drifting through morning air, the steady, unhurried pace of lives not yet broken by empire. Let us pause in this stillness, as though we are standing on a shore at dusk, hearing the last bird's call across the water. Because soon, everything will change. Soon, sails will appear at the horizon, white against the blue, carrying with them languages unfamiliar and ambitions vast. And the rhythm of Cuba, the soft, steady rhythm of a people living close to their land, will begin to bend beneath the weight of conquest. It is important to remember this beginning, because it is here that we see what is lost. Only by holding the memory of peace can we truly understand the violence of its shattering. Only by knowing how the island once breathed freely can we feel the ache of what was stolen. And so the story lingers here, in this moment before shadow, Imagine the quiet waves brushing against the shore. Imagine the voices of people unbroken, singing into the night, and know that beneath all that is to come, beneath chains, beneath wars, beneath treaties written in faraway rooms, this heartbeat remains. The heartbeat of Cuba, waiting, enduring, remembering what it means to be free. As we let this opening rest, like a gentle note fading into silence, we step slowly into the next part of the story, where the horizon darkens and the first shadows of empire begin to fall. History often begins not with thunder, but with the quiet arrival of sails on the horizon. For Cuba, the first touch of empire did not come with fire immediately, but with a slow and steady unfolding, like a shadow stretching across the land, unnoticed at first, until it covered everything. The Spanish ships appeared, their flags fluttering against the wind, carrying men who looked upon the island not with wonder, but with hunger. To them, Cuba was not a home already alive with spirit and tradition. It was a prize. At first, the presence of Spain seemed like a passing cloud. Soldiers and traders stepped ashore, speaking words the islanders did not know, offering gifts that glittered, tools of iron, fabrics of bright colors. But beneath these offerings lived intention, the desire to root themselves here, to claim not only the land but the people as their own. What began with trade soon deepened into control. Fortresses rose along the coast. Cannons pointed not toward the sea for protection, but inward to ensure obedience. The soil of Cuba, once nurtured for sustenance, was now forced into the service of empire. Vast fields of sugar cane stretched further than the eye could see. Tobacco was harvested not for the people, but for markets across the ocean, and behind it all lay the relentless demand for labor. Slavery was no longer just a rumor whispered from other lands. It was a system, sharp and merciless, imposed upon bodies that had no choice but to bend. Men and women who once sang while they worked now toiled under the crack of the whip, their song silenced, their dignity stolen. The Spanish crown called it progress. They spoke of civilization, of order, of faith brought to those they claimed lived in darkness. But to those who lived on the island, it felt like suffocation. Every acre of land transformed into profit was another piece of life taken away. Every day spent under command was another reminder that the rhythm of Cuba was no longer its own. And yet, even in those early years, resistance stirred. It began quietly, like a murmur running through the countryside. Families whispered by firelight of injustice. Small groups gathered in the shadows of forests, speaking of freedom in voices low but determined. Some ran into the mountains, forming hidden communities of escape, clinging to the possibility of life beyond chains. These acts did not yet erupt into full rebellion, but they were seeds. Seeds that would later grow into movements, into wars, into the fire of independence. Still, the Spanish grip tightened. Governors were appointed to rule with iron. Priests declared the will of empire as the will of God, and soldiers marched through villages as if to remind every Cuban that the island belonged not to them, but to the crown. The sense of home was slowly rewritten into a sense of possession. And here is where the first cracks began to form in the soul of the island. For to live under empire is not only to lose freedom, it is to lose the quiet dignity of belonging to oneself. The Cuban people could feel it in the heaviness of their days, in the way mothers wept for sons taken into forced labor, in the way songs of joy became songs of sorrow. Empire did not only command the body, it tried to reshape the heart. If you listen closely to history, you can almost hear those whispers of unrest moving through the palm groves, riding on the warm night air. The people of Cuba were not yet ready to fight an open war, but they were already refusing in spirit, and refusal, even in silence, carries power. The beginning of conflict, then, was not one single battle or declaration. It was this: the slow, suffocating realization that the island was no longer its own, and the quiet but unyielding decision deep in the hearts of the people that someday, somehow, they would reclaim it. And so, as the shadows deepened, the stage was set for the island's first great uprising. The murmurs of resistance would grow louder until the silence broke, and Cuba's struggle would move from whispered defiance into the fire of war. The silence of submission never lasts forever. Beneath the weight of empire, beneath the years of labor and the chains of slavery, something within the Cuban spirit continued to stir. It began in whispers, in quiet conversations carried by the wind across sugar fields and in mountain hideouts. But whispers, when joined together, become a chorus, and that chorus would grow into the roar of defiance. By the mid 19th century, the longing for freedom could no longer be contained. Farmers, poets, workers, and former slaves, people from every walk of life, felt the same restless fire. The promise of dignity, long stolen, demanded to be reclaimed. And so, in 1868, the first great cry for independence was declared. It was called El Grito de Yara, the cry of Yara. With those words, the 10 Years' War began. The war did not start with grand armies or endless supplies. It began with resolve. Ordinary people, armed with little more than machetes, rose against one of the most powerful empires in the world. Their strength was not in weapons, but in conviction. They fought with the knowledge that freedom, even if distant, was worth more than life under domination. And though their battles often ended in loss, each act of resistance lit another flame across the island. The struggle was uneven, and the cruelty of empire was swift. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Families were torn apart, fathers imprisoned, sons executed as warnings. The Spanish crown sought to make an example of Cuba, to show that rebellion would only bring pain. Yet, with every punishment, the desire for freedom only deepened. The people learned that even suffering could not silence the dream of independence. For 10 long years, the war dragged on. 10 years of skirmishes in forests, ambushes along dusty roads, and battles where hope often outweighed ammunition. Leaders rose from the people, figures who carried not only weapons, but the hearts of their followers. They became symbols, living reminders that Cuba's struggle was not in vain. And though Spain's armies outnumbered them, though defeat visited them time and again, the rebels returned, as if carried by the very spirit of the island itself. Yet, the cost was immense. Crops withered under the weight of neglect, families starved, and thousands lost their lives. For every Cuban who picked up a weapon, many more bore the quiet suffering of displacement and loss. Mothers mourned sons who never returned. Children grew up in the shadow of war, their laughter replaced by silence. The dream of freedom was alive, but it was written in blood. And when, after a decade, exhaustion finally forced the rebels into uneasy compromise, the result was bitter. The Pact of San Juan ended the war without granting true independence. Promises of reform were made, but they felt hollow, like ashes in the mouth of those who had given everything. Cuba remained bound to Spain, and the sacrifices of 10 years seemed to fade into futility. Yet history moves not only in victories, but in the seeds left behind. The 10 Years' War, though incomplete, planted a truth deep within the Cuban heart, that freedom was possible, and that the island's people were willing to pay the price for it. Even in defeat, the idea of independence did not die. It simply rested, waiting for the moment to rise again. So the First War ended, but the struggle continued. Hidden in the silence of fields, whispered in the songs of mothers, carried in the eyes of children who had grown up knowing only conflict. The ember of resistance, though buried under ash, still glowed faintly, and like all embers, it only needed breath to ignite once more. As the story lingers here, we see a truth about struggle, that even in apparent failure, the human spirit cannot be extinguished. The First War left scars, but it also left memory. And memory, when passed from one generation to the next, becomes destiny. And so, as Cuba licked its wounds and buried its dead, the island was not finished. Another chapter waited. Another war would come, and the dream of freedom, though delayed, would once again set fire to the land. When the First Great War ended, it did not end in freedom. The Pact of Zanjan, signed in 1878, promised reforms and small concessions, but the heart of the matter remained unchanged. Cuba still belonged to Spain. For those who had bled and starved for 10 years, the agreement felt like a cruel compromise, a bandage placed over a wound that had not been healed. The fields lay in ruin, families mourned their dead, and yet the island was still bound in chains. But history is restless, and the Cuban spirit, though tired, did not vanish into silence. Out of the ashes of the 10 Years' War rose a new generation, sons who had grown up during the fighting, daughters who had carried grief since childhood. They inherited not only the pain, but also the unfinished dream of independence. The taste of near liberation lingered like a half-forgotten melody, and it would not let them rest. In the years that followed, Cuba entered what many called the Little War. It was smaller in scale, less remembered by the world, but to Cubans, it was another attempt to break the hold of empire. Once again, machetes and rifles were raised against Spanish troops. Once again, villages whispered of freedom, and families risked everything for a cause that seemed eternal. Yet once more, the strength of Spain's armies and the lack of foreign support left the effort faltering. The Little War ended too, with disappointment, and still, the island did not surrender. Between wars, Cuba's people endured a strange twilight. The Spanish crown tried to patch the cracks with promises of reforms, but these reforms were shallow, more words than substance. Discrimination remained. Slavery still scarred the island's social fabric, and the voices calling for independence only grew louder with time. It was in this atmosphere that leaders like José Martí emerged, voices not only of rebellion, but of vision. Martí wrote with fire and tenderness, painting a picture of a Cuba that belonged to itself, a Cuba not bound to Spain or any empire, but free to shape its destiny. His words became a lantern in the darkness, guiding those who had grown weary of endless cycles of defeat. Martí understood what treaties had failed to provide, that freedom was not granted by negotiations with oppressors, but by the unyielding demand of a people who refused to forget their worth. And so, by the 1890s, the flame rose again. Another war, fiercer and more determined, swept across the island, the War of Independence. Once again, the forests filled with rebels, the fields became battlegrounds, and the people gave themselves to the cause. It was as if the unfinished business of the 10 Years' War had returned with doubled strength. But empires rarely yield easily. Spain, though weakened, fought with desperation to hold on to its colony. Villages were destroyed. Civilians herded into camps under cruel policies that caused hunger and disease. The suffering was immense, and yet Cuba endured. The war might have stretched on even longer had not another power stepped into the story. The United States, watching from across the sea, entered the conflict in 1898 after the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. They declared themselves liberators, claiming to help Cuba finally achieve what it had sought for so long. But liberation under one empire often became the shadow of another. When Spain fell, it was not Cuba that stood alone in victory, but the United States who placed its flag upon the story. The Treaty of Paris ended Spanish rule, yet it bound Cuba to a new master. Though independence was spoken of, in practice the island found itself under the watchful eye of Washington, its sovereignty incomplete, its freedom still conditional. Thus, the cycle repeated itself. Wars fought with courage, treaties written with ink that carried betrayal. The Cuban people again and again had to learn that their struggle was not only against armies, but against the weight of empires who saw the island not as a home, but as a prize. And so, as we step from one war into another uneasy peace, we see the pattern of history. Victories promised but not delivered, treaties signed but not honored, and always, in the center, the people, waiting, enduring, carrying the heavy cost of dreams deferred. This chapter closes not with triumph, but with a question that lingers in the silence. If freedom is promised but never given, how long can a people endure before the dream itself becomes a wound too deep to heal? War leaves more than broken cities and treaties. It leaves broken lives. In Cuba, the scars of decades of struggle etch themselves not only into the land, but into the very spirit of its people. For every battle remembered, there were countless quiet tragedies forgotten. Families torn apart, children growing without fathers, mothers burying their sons in soil already heavy with grief. These were the wounds no treaty could heal, the invisible inheritance passed from one generation to the next. Life for ordinary Cubans in the shadow of empire was a daily negotiation with survival. The sugar fields, once tended for sustenance, became engines of exploitation. Slavery had left behind not just shackles, but deep divisions, lines drawn between races and classes, ensuring that even as freedom was whispered, equality remained distant. Former slaves carried the memory of chains in their bodies, while their children struggled to define what freedom meant when true justice was still withheld. In the cities, poverty pressed heavily on the poor. The wealthy elite, tied closely to colonial rule or foreign interests, lived in comfort, while the majority labored endlessly for wages that barely sustained them. Hunger was a familiar companion in Cuban homes. Disease spread easily in the overcrowded quarters where the displaced were forced to live. The promise of peace after each war did not bring prosperity. It brought silence, and in that silence, despair. But perhaps the deepest wound was not material, but emotional. To grow up in Cuba during these years was to inherit a history of unfinished dreams. Children listened as elders spoke of independence that never truly arrived. They heard of sacrifices made, of fathers who died in the forests for freedom, and yet, when they looked around, they still saw foreign flags, foreign soldiers, foreign laws. This dissonance carved confusion into young hearts. How could so much blood be spilled, and still the island not belong to its own people? Entire generations carried this burden. Those who had been children during the 10 Years' War became adults during the War of Independence, raising their own children under the shadow of American intervention. Freedom always seemed near, yet always out of reach. The cycle of hope and disappointment left a quiet exhaustion, as if the soul of the nation was being asked to endure more than any people should. And yet, within the suffering, there was resilience. Families found ways to preserve dignity, through music, through storytelling, through faith. Even when food was scarce, songs were shared. Even when hope felt fragile, elders spoke softly of a future where Cuba would truly belong to Cubans. This act of remembering, of carrying the dream even when reality crushed it, was itself a form of resistance. Still, the losses were undeniable. A generation lost to the machete wars, another lost to hunger and reconcentration camps, another to the disillusionment of foreign control. These wounds shaped Cuba's identity, etching into its people a deep awareness of suffering, but also a deep well of endurance. To be Cuban, in those years, was to know pain, but also to know that survival was itself an act of defiance. And as the decades turned, the memories did not fade. They lingered in lullabies sung by mothers to restless children, in the quiet prayers whispered by grandfathers at night, in the stories passed down by those who refused to let history be erased. These wounds, though heavy, became part of the nation's heartbeat. They taught the people that freedom is not given, it is carried, endured, and reclaimed, even across generations. So we see here, in this chapter, not the clash of armies, but the quiet war of survival, the war of hunger, of memory, of enduring in the face of disappointment. These were battles without banners, but battles nonetheless, and though they did not appear in the treaties signed by empires, they define the spirit of Cuba more deeply than any document ever could. As we close this part of the story, we step back and look at the island not only as land, but as a living soul, scarred yet unbroken, a soul that, despite generations of loss, continued to remember what freedom might feel like. And it is in that remembering that the strength for the future was preserved, because the wounds of Cuba were not only marks of suffering, they were also seeds. Seeds that, when the time came, would bloom again into resistance, into hope, into the unyielding demand for dignity. When we look back at Cuba's long and restless journey, what we find is not simply a record of battles and treaties, of armies and politics. We find something quieter, something deeper, the endurance of a people who were asked again and again to carry the weight of empire, and who, despite their suffering, refused to let their spirit be extinguished. Cuba's story is one of shadows, cast first by Spain and later by the United States. From the earliest days of conquest, when ships appeared on the horizon, to the drawn-out wars for independence, to the uneasy promises written into foreign treaties, the island lived under powers that did not see it as home, but as possession. Yet within that shadow, there was always a heartbeat, a steady rhythm, like waves against the shore, reminding us that empires may command, but they cannot claim the soul of a people. The scars of those centuries run deep. They live in the songs sung by descendants, in the stories whispered at night, in the quiet dignity of families who held on to hope even when hope seemed fragile. These scars are not only wounds, they are reminders, reminders that freedom is never simple, never easy, and never given without sacrifice. They remind us, too, that the cost of oppression is not measured only in lost lives, but in lost dreams, lost futures, lost generations who might have lived differently if history had been kinder. And yet, even as we reflect on the pain, we cannot ignore the resilience. For what is more remarkable than the ability of a people to rise again after so much loss? The Cuban struggle was not a single war, not a single cry of rebellion. It was a series of returns, an unbroken thread running through decades. Each time an empire sought to silence it, the dream re-emerged, stronger, clearer, carried by new voices, new hearts. This is perhaps the truest legacy. Not the shadow of empire, but the endurance of Cuba itself. There is something almost meditative in this truth, that while power shifts from one hand to another, while treaties are signed and governments change, the essence of a people endures quietly beneath it all. Like roots beneath scorched earth, it waits, it survives, and when the time is right, it grows again. Cuba's struggle is not only about the battles fought in the open, but about this quiet resilience, this refusal to forget what it means to belong to oneself. As we sit with this history, in the calm of reflection, we might ask ourselves what it teaches us. Perhaps it tells us that empire, no matter how vast, cannot hold forever. Perhaps it tells us that suffering, though heavy, can become the ground where endurance takes root. Perhaps it tells us that the stories of ordinary people, the mothers, the children, the laborers, the singers, carry more truth about history than the proclamations of kings and presidents. And so, when we remember Cuba, let us not remember only the chains, the wars, the treaties signed in faraway rooms. Let us also remember the songs, the whispered prayers, the resilience carried quietly in the hearts of its people. Let us remember that in the midst of empire's shadow, there was always light, small, fragile, but unyielding. Tonight, as we close this story, let the rhythm slow again, like waves soft against the shore. Imagine the island at dusk, the sea glowing with the last colors of the day, the palm trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Imagine the voices of those long gone, their struggle carried across time, whispering not only of pain, but of dignity. Imagine Cuba not as a land defined by conquest, but as a soul that endures, waiting for its song to be fully its own. And in this stillness, may we hear what history has to offer, not only warnings of what empire can do, but reminders of what the human heart can endure. The Cuban struggle may be heavy, but it is also luminous, a testament to survival, to memory, to hope that refuses to fade. As the story fades into silence, let it rest within you like a lullaby, gentle, solemn, yet carrying the quiet strength of endurance. And may it remind us, long after the words end, that no shadow, however long, can erase the light of a people who remember who they are